So now we are set up. We have the proper image. We're good to go.
All
So,
right.
welcome to the stream. I'm just going to do a little usual preamble. So, this is the fourth stream of this Scream weekend that we're having at Hiveworks under the hashtag BEEHOME. So, follow the hashtag or follow the Hiveworks social media to get more news about what we're doing. If you yourself are doing a bunch of panels this weekend as an artist, feel free to also use the hashtag to promote what you're doing. If you're currently joining in on Twitch, you will see that below the streaming window, we've got a couple links going on. So if you go to the links, you can check out our store. We currently have a sale going on with the code SPRING2020. You can save 10% and get all those sweet, sweet books. We currently have 2 Kickstarters going. The first book of Alice and Nightmare and the first book of Among Us. Both are very good books to read that you should definitely check out. I love both, so I'm extremely biased, but my opinion is pretty good, so you should definitely take it. Alice in the Nightmare is a YA book about a young girl going to school in Wonderland to learn to be essentially a dream catcher, to basically convert that to energy, and it's really like an elaborate world. It's really cool. Among Us is a romance story, which is relevant to today's panel. Aside from Hiveworks, there's also Iron Circus making a bunch of streams under the hashtag PajamaCon. Definitely check those out too. Those are pretty great as well. And keep a lookout on anybody promoting anybody under ECCC Online. It's a bunch of people who have created a bunch of merch for Emerald City that weren't able to sell it because the con got canceled. So if you want to find some nice swag, check out those hashtags. If you are logging in later to this video, if you're not able to attend, all of these will be posted to YouTube after this. So all this is recorded, it's going to be posted, it's going to be accessible, and any stuff that we talk about in the chat is going to be linked to. So to sort of introduce the people that are in this stream. So this stream is the Slow Burn Romance and Fantasy Story stream. Oh yeah, it's gonna get smoochy. That's for sure. Not among each other, but, emotionally.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty broad assumption. I mean, we don't know how this panel's going to go.
Oh, Rennie. Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know stuff was already going to go this way,
Who's
but I mean...
promised smooches?
So the people who are here, we have Allison Shaw, who was here at a panel yesterday as well, who is now returning, better than ever, stronger, more efficient. Allison is the author of several comics, including Tigress Queen and Far to the North, and our best-selling book, Persephone. All very good. Definitely check them out. Persephone can actually be purchased in a store right now for a discount, so definitely do that. We also have Rennie Kingsley, who is the author of The Weave, which is a beautiful, intricate comic that is inspired by Irish lore, among other things, about a girl who is dealing with a court of fairies. Very difficult thing to deal with.
It's super fun and super gay.
Very, very gay.
Very, very, very gay.
Gay smooches. We have Meg, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly, Severed.
That's pretty close. Siverud.
Oh, great. As a fellow person whose name is always massacred, I can definitely relate. So Meg is the author of Daughter of the Lilies, an excellent fantasy comic about a masked mage trying to find her place in the world. Super good. Definitely give it a read. And finally, there is me and Megan Levy-Heaton, my partner. We are both the authors of Namesake. I'm Isabelle Melanson. I should say my actual name. So we're all here to talk about Les Smoochies. So let us begin. To sort of give a little preamble on the actual topic. So romance is a very complex genre with a huge history. Specifically, romance in fantasy has its own really big history that's also been renowned to be very separated by gender. Especially in the 70s when harlequins were becoming really, really big, you had a lot of authors that would write a lot of time travel fantasies or fantasy stories within the realm of harlequin, and they would be female authors. They would write something that would be very different than what you'd have in like the more mainstream fantasy, like your Wheels of Times and your Swords of Truth and your Game of Thrones, where the romance between male lead and female leads was somewhat more, forceful is definitely a term that I could use, but definitely more like the hardened warrior sees the other hardened warrior, and after like 5 grunts they're gonna bang or something. So like definitely a very different mood. So today's topic is sort of building on how like this whole history and this whole like gender divide is becoming more and more like united, especially in webcomics, where you have like authors of all genders basically making works and really digging into what to do with romance and how to write good romance that, is not necessarily good romance, because you have a lot of romances that are complex in the sense that they're very broken, but are good because they're compelling. So, but then you have other ones that are good because they're compelling, but also good because they give you like feel good feelings in your very hard heart, So now, I just kind of wanted to talk about that, and I think the first topic in this chat that I would like everybody to sort of chime into is why integrate romance into a fantasy plot in the first place. So
that's actually a question.
It is. Like, why have romance spice it up? Why can't you just have people on the quest? So let's open the floor to that, starting with Rennie. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I actually feel that so much of fantasy stories, is exactly what it says in the name. They're fantastic. They are otherworldly. They are outside of the range of normal experience. And sometimes that's as simple as just an adventure that you would never go on. And I feel like romance is something really elemental and personal and human. And it makes it a much more richer experience to immerse yourself in a fantasy story when you have that really human element.
That's a pretty good point. Ready, opening strong. Megan, what's your Megan L, what's your follow-up on that?
I've always found that romances are very, very empowering, especially ones written in this decade. Especially, it's been an avenue of character growth. It's not the only avenue of character growth. I just want to make that absolutely clear. But it's very empowering. It's a sign of growth. And also, too, especially when fantasies, if your quest turns really, really dark, the romance adds kind of a hopeful side to it. It's kind of like, here is some of that. Here is a particular goal you can get for getting to the other side of this quest.
Have some of that dopamine. So it's a bit of a riff on like the sexual and romantic partner as a reward, but like in a positive way.
Yes, but be clear. Sexual romance is not the only type of romance. There are platonic romances and all sorts of romance.
Yeah, definitely. The aces in the audience, including myself. Thank you for that little shout out. Yeah, woo. So Megan asks, what is your take on why to include romance in a fantasy story?
Well, Megan kind of touched on it a little bit already, but like a lot of storytelling has to do with character arcs. A character at the end of a story has to be a different character than they were at the beginning. In a lot of fantasy, all of those arcs appear to be external, right? They get better at sword fighting, they get better at fighting bad guys and whatnot. So most of what you see in a character in a fantasy novel are external conflicts and objects of growth. But man, romance really gives you an opportunity to kind of give them that internal character arc, to kind of like see how they grow as a person and as a personality through their experiences and the way that they treat others. So, man, I just think romance is a really great storytelling tool if that's the kind of story you create as a form of personal growth in the way that they treat important.
It's essentially to pair the hero growth with an emotional growth, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And then also like kind of challenging their own perception of the world and all those perceptions, the decisions that.
Oh, you're breaking up a little bit, Megan. Be sure to stay near to your microphone, eh?
Oh yeah, no worries. Sorry about that.
How about you, Ellie? What's your take on why to include romance in a fantasy story?
I tend to see it more from like the fun aspect. I will absolutely read a story I have no interest in just to see two characters make out later. I'm such trash when it comes to that. So,
You're here.
A lot of people have brought up some great points about like, from a story aspect, from a character building aspect. Yes, those are all great and wonderful. And for me, I'm just shipping trash.
Well, I mean, isn't the enjoyment, the trashy aspect, it's led to a lot of development because, as I was saying a bit earlier, when stuff was very like gender divided in the 70s, when people were really starting to like dig into female voices or queer voices talking about this, it was purely in the enjoyment category. It was purely the Harlequin, authorship and readership that was really pushing the envelope. So I do think that enjoyment has a huge piece of it. I mean, shipping itself is like a huge motor to creative works. So that it's like a solid take. I abide by it. It's good. But I think a lot of points that were brought up sort of bring us to the next sort of aspect to this talk, which is like, if you're building a romance in, a fantasy setting, you can have it for flavor, but, when you make it interesting, you kind of have to have interesting characters. They have to have goals that mesh with it. They have to have a compelling inner life that meshes with it, that makes you feel like the romance isn't coming from anywhere, that like there's an actual, payoff. So how do you build this character chemistry in the context of a fantasy world? Because, in the context of a modern story, often they're like stuck in the same space, like a workplace or a school. But, how do you unite them in the context of a fantasy story? What unites them in the context of a quest? What makes them compelling as individuals and then as a couple? So let's talk about that. But let's reverse the order and start with Allie.
Oh, just put me on the spot here.
Yeah, that's my job.
Yeah, basically it's like you said, like the characters do have to start with a goal. I've noticed that there is a trend where a lot of authors will like create a character that doesn't have a goal. They're just kind of there. And it's very easy for that kind of character to fall into the category of an accessory for another character to just fall in love with. Like
the childhood friend.
Problem.
Like the one, like in all anime, you have the childhood friend who's just there.
I mean, they can absolutely like have their own goals, but that is, one of the archetypes that crop up. Mainly the problem is just when, literally only exists to be pursued by the main character, or just, tits on the screen. And every character has to have a goal, and the romance has to either fit in with that goal or stand against that goal, which is a character development opportunity. So what does the character want out of life that this other character can provide for them?
Okay. So essentially the rich inner life that you think is there and how the characters sort of create a relationship is goal-oriented?
Yes. I mean, you're not going through life just existing. Like, you usually have something you're looking forward to. And if you meet someone that, like, you have a crush on or whatever, that person is going to have to fit into your plans for the future in some way. And if they don't, is that person important enough to you to where you change your plans for the future?
Mm-hmm. So to sort of keep it going with Megan S. So I think something we're really getting here is that, like, in real life, obviously your goals have to mesh with a potential partner. But in the context of a fantasy story, those goals become, like, very tangible and often story driven, because it's usually like a fantasy story usually has a very specific goal, defeat the king, find the object, find where you belong, find the wizard. Like there's a very tangible story goal. So usually a character's emotional and like aspirational goals are tied to that pretty heavily. So like an emotional goal or like a romance would be tied to that also. So how do you kind of deal with that? Like you yourself with your characters, you've got Tissel that's kind of looking for her place. That's like her aspirational goal. How does that mesh with a romantic goal?
I'm sorry, is this question for the group or for me?
It's for you, but anybody else who's got an opinion can definitely chime in.
Sorry about that.
You made a mistake of asking me if I have an opinion. I always have an opinion. I can I jump in? Is it okay? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
No, I think very much relationship goals a relationship can be used to further goals because relationships are all about emotional learning and communication and vulnerability, and a lot of the time, like learning those things through being with others can advance you towards goals, like you said, of understanding yourself and personal growth.
But how do you sort of contextualize that with the fact that the story you're doing has very clear goals, Because in a modern setting, a character's goals and the goals of like the story may be more, generic, like find yourself, build your life. But in a fantasy story, you've got a very like clear defined goal of like find the Holy Grail, get the crystal, How does more esoterical emotional goals kind of mesh with that?
No, Meg, you go. I just went, you go.
Man, I'd argue that, you're the author, so you're in control of every event in the story. So I would argue that you could somehow tie in the goals of the relationship or the transformation that occurs in the relationship to the ultimate, I'm going to call it external goal of the story of saving the whatever. Speaking specifically from my project, Daughter of the Lilies, my main character, if she existed in a vacuum with no other people around, would not change because she's too stuck in her head. So she needs other people to challenge her perceptions of the world and of other people in order to prepare her for whatever final conflict she needs to face. Honestly, if you can find a way to tie in some very fundamental emotional lesson into the relationship in an organic way to prepare your characters for the goal of at the end of the story, like that can make the entire storytelling process feel really and make people immediately way more invested. I could repeat myself further but that's basically it.
Moving a bit away from goals, then let's talk a bit more about the smoochies. So what is, like, in a setting of a fantasy, of a fairy-based story, what is like your ideal duo, What is the ideal couple that you want to do? And, around those characters, what is the ideal kind of rival or friends that you'd like to have around them to sort of help the relationship bloom? Like, what is your ideal pairing?
Let me just pull out my Twitter post about this, my favorite kind of ships. Gosh, we should post those along with this panel because that just did all the work for us.
Yeah, I love that meme.
Oh, it was my favorite thing in the world.
I did have one specific one. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, your turn.
The one specific one I had was the beauty who brings out the beauty in the beast, and the beast who brings out the beast in beauty.
Ah,
Ooh,
that's a good one.
That's extremely good.
Yes. That is very good. Megan L, you've been pretty quiet. What's your favorite sort of arrangement?
Other than slow burn, I absolutely love friends to lovers romances, which is why in fantasy things such as like Lena and Gari in Slayers, they are my ideal romance. And I particularly love our romance and Namesake, not just between Emma and Warwick, and also between Alice and Selva, which both of them had a very, very strong basis in friendship before it became a romance.
Yeah, it's always fun when you have two characters like that kind of have the Achilles and Patroclus sort of relationship where it's like, man, I've been fighting next to this guy for like a while. He's kind of hot. What's going on? What is happening? That's always a pretty good dynamic. What about you, Rennie? What's your ideal like match?
Oh God, that's that's one of the hardest questions I've ever been asked. I mean, my webcomic very much centers around the dynamic between three people.
So you do have always like a larger group to work from when you write romance.
Yeah. And
more to go around.
More to go around, and also like more complicated dynamics, like how they play off of each other. It's great and fun, and also incredibly difficult to write. Don't do it. I mean, my favorite dynamics kind of boil down to, and if you've read my webcomic, you absolutely know exactly who I'm talking about. Thinks he's smooth but dumb guy, hot mean girl who secretly cares very much, and very much gentle, empathetic girl who will also bop you on the nose.
I mean, I get that. Like, I feel like everything I write is like tough, semi-muscular girl who can bench press a wizard, and the wizard she bench presses. So, you know.
Yes.
I'm definitely in that horrible. Well, no, it's great. I have no shame.
This is a panel where we don't judge each other.
No, keep the judgment at the door. There is only smooches here.
We are here to revel in our shame.
If you can't revel anywhere else if not with other romance writers, then where can you?
Exactly.
But here's a more like even more complicated question, like what's your favorite pairing? But like when you're creating a pairing in a story, fantasy or otherwise, though ideally more in the fantasy case, what is the kind of like flaw that you want the romance to sort of force one of the characters or both of them to correct? Like, is it hubris? Is it wrath? Is it we're just going to do all the 7 deadly sins, just Full Metal Alchemist style? Like, what is the flaw that love is supposed to help bridge?
Well, gosh, like honestly, all of them, but not all at once. That's the simplest answer I can give.
Pace yourself.
All people are different.
Exactly.
All people need different help.
Exactly. Like one thing at a time, please.
I think the most basic building blocks of that is just vulnerability and empathy. Like,
yeah,
and those two things, and those two things lead into like everything else.
Specifically about vulnerability, that's actually a good reason to have romance in any story, because when you have the level of vulnerability in any of the characters, they're willing to show more of their character than they would without that relationship being there.
Yeah.
So just imagine if you're following some dude like in The Witcher or whatever, and he's just grunting half the time. What do you learn about him? You learn way more when he has a girlfriend involved.
Yeah, it's true.
Or a bard.
Like or a bard. I'm like specifically thinking.
You can have a girlfriend and a bard at the same time. It's 2020.
You have two hands.
When you're in the quest, you get so into the quest, that you forget the humans involved in it or the other beings that are involved in it. You're forgetting that there are consequences to this quest. You're just focused on the quest. And so part of what the romance can do is have your character reconnect to the world in an elemental way instead of just being hyper focused on quest. Kind of like how in Game of Thrones with Jaime and Brienne, that relationship, even though the TV series massively fucked it up.
What last season? I didn't watch that.
Yes. What the whole point of the Jaime Brienne romance was, it connected Brienne to the world beyond her quest just to become a knight.
Yeah, he knighted her. Like, that was like the best last part in like the pile of garbage in that final season.
You did not recognize the last season. Don't bring that up now.
All right, yes, so but here's like a bit of a harder question though. Like, sort of like, let's keep talking about like what flaws are being sort of bridged by romance, but also like what qualities do you want romance to bring out in characters? What is quintessentially like the heroism that romance is supposed to push forward?
I think it goes back to I think it was Renee was saying, like, just vulnerability and empathy, like, because if you don't have those two things, you end up with a super toxic group. And through those two things, explore a lot of other elements as well.
Yeah,
it also spurs on selflessness and I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I agree.
It spurs on selflessness, a desire to grow as a person on your own because you want to be the best version of yourself for your love interest.
Yeah.
And it also spurs on a sense of self-confidence, because one of the most powerful things for self-confidence is just having someone who like loves you unconditionally.
Yeah.
And like that just makes you stronger as a hero, essentially.
Well, then also like, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I feel like unconditional love is definitely a great motivator too, because like it's extremely aspirational. Like, I feel like it's something a lot of people in reality feel they kind of missed out on. So finding it in a fantasy story and being able to sort of patch that through to the characters you identify with, the characters you love, like it brings out a lot of feelings in a reader, I find. Because there's a lot of people I feel have like this kind of basic love that doesn't really exist in their life because, you know, they have shitty parents or whatever. So like it's definitely extremely aspirational to have just that kind of feeling, like someone that loves you, that learns to love you unconditionally, that supports you. Like, it's good for the characters and it's good for like the readers.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I grew up with a lot of really toxic romantic examples in media because a lot of the wrong things were kind of idealized. It feels like we're starting to get into a different thing entirely. Like, there is a lot of importance in making sure you represent a relationship that is healthy and does encourage the characters to grow, especially if they don't end up together at the end. Like, because there were so many stories that I read where the characters were so not good for each other and still ended up because that was what was expected of the story. And that's not necessarily the best way to respect your reader, almost.
Whereas now we've got a bit of a trend away from the more toxic roles, but more towards the idea of like a relationship is not necessarily permanent, but an ideal relationship is one that helps you grow.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if it's not, even if it doesn't stay with you, even if you're not like destined to be like forever.
You don't have to have a happily ever after. You just have a happy period that helps you with your life.
Which I think is the big difference between a fantasy story and like a traditional romance novel. The traditional romances, the goal is happy ending. Anything other than a happy ending will piss off people. And in fantasy, that's
trash.
Yes. Oh gosh.
Oh my god. It's pretty good. So next, I mean, we can definitely talk about that. Let's talk about toxicity. Let's talk about the mix of love and lust, and
Oh boy.
let's talk about queer identities. Like, let's talk about all these tropes that are good and all these tropes that are bad. Like, what is the worst, like, toxic ideology romance, or like worst example of a romance that you've been exposed to that's kind of like haunting you?
I could not watch Twilight. I tried to, like, just this year, I tried to finally, like, watch Twilight, see what everyone was talking about, because I've absorbed everything I know about it through cultural osmosis, and I could not get past about the scene where she almost gets hit by a car. It was just awful.
Okay, I've read all the Twilight books, and I actually would recommend reading them rather than watching the movies, because it is very much a primer on what not to do, but also kind of like what people are often looking for in that type of romance story.
It's a sort of guide, basically.
Yes, yeah, and like there definitely are merits to it, in especially in terms of like understanding, you know, the straights.
Those guys.
Those guys.
I heard of those.
Those mysterious little critters. But very much Twilight. It exemplifies what young girls are often taught to look for, which is a love that is all-encompassing and all-consuming, and that's super unhealthy. Like, you need boundaries, you need respect, you need to have, like, be able to have an argument and it doesn't end the world. Like,
Yeah.
and that is like one of my least favorite things about a lot of romance stories, is the idea that because you argue, because you fight each other and don't get along, it somehow means you love each other more.
I hate that.
I hate that.
And I just bring up that boundary pushing, dear children, is a red flag. It's not cute. Not even when they're kids. It's not cute.
It's not good. It's really not good. And like, I have very much like found myself in relationships where like I allow boundary pushing because we are shown that it is not only okay, but oftentimes romantic to like keep pushing and keep pursuing and force somebody to open up more to your ideas and so on. Like, whereas a relationship is really a back and forth conversation. It's not just one side pushing forward.
I actually have
There's
like
sorry, just really quick. It also requires like a certain level of like knowing that person well enough to know when something is a hard boundary and when something is kind of like a soft no that they're not comfortable with doing, and then helping them work to that level of comfort. And too often one is more easily confused for the other. That's basically it.
I was gonna say I don't necessarily mind like negative toxic tropes in certain contexts. Like, an example I like to bring up is that movie they made not that long ago called Passenger. Like, the movie is shitty. Like, it's a shitty romance movie. But a lot of people are talking about if it was cut as a horror film, it would have been amazingly good. Like a toxic romance as a horror thing would have been so good. Like, that movie would have been crazy good if they just made it that way. So I don't think it's like all romance portrayed on screen has to be positive is not necessarily the point of this like stream, but it's the idea that like if you're using toxic themes, you have to sort of run the point with it. Like, you can have bad relationships in a story, and the bad relationships can still help the heroes grow, but like they also have consequences.
That it's bad.
Yeah, there's still consequences. Like, I can have a shitty relationship that still teaches me about myself, but at the end of the day, I also have trauma now, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
I would actually argue that it's almost more important in some ways to show negative relationships and toxic relationships. Not necessarily in like all stories. They definitely have their time and place, but we need more media that delves into it and like shows examples of what's a wrong way to treat your partner, because a lot of kids seem not to know.
Well, there was also this graphic novel that came out recently, like Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me.
Oh shit, yeah, I need to read that.
And one of the big themes in that is that, like, yeah, sometimes you gotta ditch an asshole. Like, but the relationship still made you happy, and you still had desire, and you still loved them, and you acknowledge that they're kind of an asshole because they're a little broken. Like, Laura Dean is not an okay kid. Like, the more you dive into the story, the more you see that she is just as damaged as, like, the protagonist, you know? But, like,
Yeah.
I really like the fact that there was a book that was going like, no, sometimes you have a relationship that you're really in love and the person definitely has like an interesting, captivating personality, but they have damage and it's not good damage. And sometimes the best thing you can do for the relationship is go like, thank you, I would like to unsubscribe now, you know?
I think that's key, is that the narrative has to point out this toxicity is not a good thing. It's kind of like how, you know, when Nose went after Emma and in our comic, and he went and essentially stole stuff from her brain and completely messed up her brain. And the narrative is very much like, you stupid idiot, why the hell did you do that?
Oh no, you fucked up.
You totally fucked up. And I think that's the key, is that the narrative cannot be celebrating this toxicity as a good thing, which is what I feel like Twilight does, especially in the movies, also in the books. I'm very sorry, Rennie.
Oh no, I absolutely agree. Like 1000%.
Yeah, because things like, it celebrates things like Edward stalking Bella and
I mean, if I can sort of argue a little bit, like, personally, I don't see Twilight as toxic. I think calling something like Twilight toxic is going too far. I would say that it is naively misinformed, like, at worst. Like,
extremely so. And like, I want to make it clear, I don't think that they're good books.
No, they're not good books, and they're not good relationships. Like, there's
they have a place in my heart, and they definitely taught me a lot about, you know, what not to write.
Yeah. Like, it's kind of like when you read fanfic and someone has, like, a really bad idea. Like, I feel like some of these are people actively pushing, like, an aggressive agenda.
It's just a product of our culture.
Yeah.
Yes, very much so.
It's like this weird misinformed naivete. But do continue with your point, Megan. I just kind of, like, wanted to throw that out there, that, like, it's not necessarily toxic in the sense that the author is trying to harm people, you know?
No, but I do think it is in that people take away from it as this is an ideal relationship when it's not. And so it may not be the author's intent, but the public's interpretation of it could be very, very different.
Yeah, I absolutely
once you
agree with that.
Once you publish something, it's not really yours anymore. You just have to hope for the best at a certain.
Boy, doesn't webcomics teach us that and then some, you know?
Oh God. And I really do feel like it is our responsibility as authors to be mindful and be responsible about the stories that we write and the examples that we're setting. Like, the greatest, my whole thing is that the greatest purpose of fiction is to teach us about ourselves and to give us the tools to interact with the world around us. And very, like, in romance, that is even more important in a lot of ways, because, like, the lessons that you take from when you're 16 and reading, you know, a kissy book for the first time, like, those help shape you, they help form you, and they help give you the tools you need to deal with, like, the most important relationships in your own life. Not that necessarily a romantic relationship is your most important relationship, but you know what I'm saying.
They can be super formed. Yeah.
It's also not completely out of the question to have a character who displays toxic romantic traits find happiness in the end. You really just have to show them acknowledging that their behavior is wrong and learning from it and doing better. And again, that's character development. So
that's like my biggest pet
toxicity can offer.
Well, I'm kind of thinking about, like, Pearl from Steven Universe. Like, her attachment to Steven is definitely extremely bad at first, but at the end of the series, Like she's his parent, and it's positive. Like Ali says, you can have someone who starts on the negative end that just grows into a person, and they don't have to necessarily be punished for it. You just got to show growth, you know?
And like, again, like sometimes like the person you're writing for, like your reader, is the toxic person. So I do think it is absolutely important to show that kind of narrative, so that you can grow, so that you can change, and like, here's how you do it. And step one is, actually being sorry.
Yeah. And listening and empathizing with what the other person is feeling or saying. It's what's that rule of highly successful people? Seek to understand before shoot, I wish I could remember.
You have to speak mindfully, listen intently.
Yeah. But yeah, like too often, my biggest pet peeve in a lot of media is like you have a character that has all the classic traits of an abuser or a narcissist or whatever. And then at the very end of the story, there's a very brief, like 2-minute long scene where that character says, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And then the person they abused or who has been traumatized actions immediately forgives them with no acknowledgement of like anything that or what they might still be dealing. And it's
I absolutely no, I was just gonna say I absolutely agree. Like that is one of my least favorite tropes ever, especially when it's like a parental figure who dies at the end for their child. Like
yeah.
And like it's okay that I abused you your whole life and probably tried to kill you several times because I'm dying for you now.
Yeah.
Now we're never gonna talk about it again.
That actually makes me laugh when I think about Star Wars, because Darth Vader sacrificed himself, but then he's a freaking Force ghost, so Luke could have just been like, I guess we have time to have this conversation now.
Yeah, like, okay, Dad, let's sit down and go to therapy together. That sounds great.
Therapy with your Force ghost, Dad.
Oh, man. I mean, they have all the time in the world.
Yeah, I mean, they had to do something on that rock with all the pogs.
I would absolutely watch that movie.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Luke
Just
going
like
to therapy.
Luke Skywalker going on adventures around the galaxy and then occasionally having like therapy that's moderated by Ghost Yoda. Like, yes, sign me up.
So
Meg brought up oh sorry.
No, go.
Meg brought up a great point where you have an abuser abusing throughout the entire relationship until the very end, and then you have like certain shoujo anime where the abuser abuses the entire time and then doesn't apologize and still gets forgiven time and time and again, and it's just shown to be something to aspire to, and that's just the most disgusting thing ever.
I can actually speak from personal experience here. Like, I have been in abusive relationships, and definitely when I was younger, I very much fell into the trap of thinking that forgiveness was the ultimate thing you do, like as an expression of love. Like putting your feelings aside, trying to be understanding, trying to let things go.
That's a very like Puritan approach to things.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I mean, we're just shown over and over again, that women's role is to forgive and to accept. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized, that's bullshit, and maybe you should have boundaries.
Well, maybe you should have standards.
I'd argue that, like,
maybe your standards aren't too high just because you want to be respected.
Well, I would argue that like the being forgiving aspect is the obligation of the victim. It never goes both ways.
Oh, absolutely not.
Like it's just 100% a manipulation tactic to make someone think that they're being the good person by letting all this stuff slide.
And then it puts all the responsibility onto the victim for their own abuse.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, it is just like all the emotional labor is on the victim to manage their own abuse. Like,
and then whatever the abuser is. I'm sorry, it feels like we're kind of getting away from romance in general, but it does feel like the abuser like is not challenged in that relationship because they don't want to be relation. It's their way of maintaining a status quo where they're the ones always in control. Whereas to bring it back to a more positive thing, in a healthy relationship, both people are challenged equally and called out equally and called to change equally.
I definitely think we should bring it back a little bit to romance, but this was a really interesting like foray into writing abuse and writing, you know, more negative romances, because I definitely feel like the point is here that you should write any kind of romance you want, but you should portray it realistically. So like depending on the characters' personalities and whether the romance is like positive or negative, or starts off positive and then is negative, or starts negative and then is positive, to always be realistic. But we're sort of getting into the last lap of this stream, so I wanted to really get into the topic of love and lust in the last 15 minutes. Let's do it. So,
well, that's a tone shift.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Well, gotta end on a high note. So, love and lust and how that mixes, especially in the context of a fantasy story. Like, because I feel like in a modern story, often it's the idea of like proximity that sort of blurs those lines. But how do you express, you know, going towards desire, either sexually or desire in a more general way, to just wanting that person intensely with you? Like, how do you express desire in a fantasy setting, in a fantasy romance, you know?
Okay, I'm going to start this one.
Megan has opinions.
Megan is here.
I think it's still the same. You have to have proximity. You have to be thinking about that other person at least a good bit of the time. You have to have, if not physical proximity, you need to either have that emotional proximity, being in some form of communication, because out of sight, out of mind is a legit thing. And part of lust and part of that whole aspect of a relationship is being within some sort of contact with each other. And I think that is exactly the same in fantasy as it is in traditional romance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, because ultimately, all romance, all writing character arcs, I mean, it all comes back down to you are writing a human person and their relationships with others, and those things are still true whether, you know, they're riding dragons while they're doing it or not.
What about the idea of like expressing love, or rather, which is often lust at first sight in a story, you know? Because a lot of what we focused on today was the idea of constructing a relationship, but, you know, it still happens that people kind of have that little like pang when they meet someone. So like, how do you express that realistically in this kind of setting?
Rather than how to express it, I just want people to be able to tell the difference. Like, let's absolutely explore lust and infatuation. Those are totally fun things, but let's not treat it like it's true love. Like, you're not going to get unconditional love from a situation where your relationship is built on lust, or you only just met and it's infatuation. So absolutely, let's like have fun with all of these things, but be realistic in which category the relationship is in at this specific time.
Yeah.
I feel like in namesake, and that's all the credit goes to you here, Isa. Like when Alice and Selva first met each other, you could tell in the art, even though it's not explicitly spelled out, they were both like, I tap this. There is that undercurrent of lust there, but it's not necessarily spelled out to the reader, this character is in lust with the other. And from there, you have that relationship start to grow and become a bit more external until they finally got together. But from the beginning, and I especially think in art, because you can show that through facial expressions and things like
That's
that.
actually a really good point. I forgot we were talking about comics. That is like a visual aspect.
Yes. So I think that's a really good way of subtly showing that initial lust without having to slam people over the head with a book.
No, I absolutely agree. Like, character acting is one of your greatest tools in comics to communicate, unspoken feelings and emotions. And definitely thinking somebody has hot legs falls into that category.
And you can definitely do that with the framing too. Like, just have a character sort of like linger a little bit and be like, damn, that's a nice butt.
Exactly. You can communicate a lot with like bubbles in the background, including that somebody has a nice butt.
Sometimes you just like, there's just a perfect light and you're like, that ass. So I guess there's like, so we kind of went through the idea that like, you need a lot of vulnerability, you need a lot of communication, art is important, toxic relationships are not necessarily banned, even though, Twitter might disagree, but you do have to write them realistically. So that's a lot of stuff, to go through. But if you'd have to say, what was your biggest influence in the romance that you're telling right now? Not the first romance you told, but what is the biggest influence to the story you're telling right now?
Oh man, that's actually a tough question.
We aren't here for easy questions, Megan. We're here for the
man.
deep, dark stuff.
Oh boy. Man, I'd say that each character has to exist independently of the other first. Like, they have to have their own goals that do not extend to the person they ultimately want to be in a relationship with. And you have to know those characters well enough on their own before you can write a believable relationship.
Yeah, that's definitely points we've been over, but like, what has brought, you were saying earlier in the chat yourself that at first you wrote more toxic relationships. Oh. What has influenced your work to come to this conclusion and to start writing stuff like this?
Shoot. Well, again, I'm struggling a little bit to find an answer, honestly. But I think it's just a mutual respect for both people. And I know that's something we've said already, but I guess specifically with Brent and Thistle, they did start as a very toxic relationship because that was the only reference I had to draw from. For
I mean, I do remember some of those earlier edits.
Ooh, they're so bad.
Yeah, I was there for those.
Oh, they're so bad. I'm really glad I did not start the comic right away when those were written, just because how awful Brent was. And even in that, if I had kept going with that story, they would not have ended up together. How bad of a romance it was. But I think it's just like, you know what it is? It's learning that one does not have to be entirely submissive to the other for a relationship to exist in place. Like, both people's emotions are important in that relationship.
You're cutting up. You're cutting out a little bit. Can you repeat the last sentence and get closer to the microphone?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'm on a phone, so my service isn't that great today, and my internet has been spotty. So I apologize to everybody listening. I think it's just realizing that the emotions of both people are super important in that relationship, and then also, shoot, I've lost my thought a little bit. Oh, you know what? It's not being entirely submissive to another person to make a relationship work or be.
So you think it was basically exposure to other offers and other works that basically pulled you away from that because you were exposed to just like general media products and like isolated in that, so you kind of stuck with what you knew basically.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's like it's a level of investment in the emotional and mental health of the other person and not specifically what they can give you. Yeah, I think this is starting to play back into about, but writing that relationship has been a very healing and a very educational experience, to say the least. So I think that just prioritizing the mental health of both individuals, which is something I've been passionate about for a very long, has helped a lot in making a relationship in a piece of media that is very easy to get invested in.
Does anybody else have anything they want to say about their influences towards becoming the kind of writer they are now?
Yes. But Allison, go first, and then I have an opinion.
Okay. So Meg mentioned that a lot of her examples that she had to learn from were bad. And so, like, you know, the relationships she ended up reflecting in her work, like, ended up looking like those relationships. And in my case, I was actually so dissatisfied with the existing relationships that I had seen on TV and in other media that the relationships I wanted to portray were actually in direct defiance of those tropes. So I wanted to treat my female characters especially with a sense of dignity that I was not seeing in the examples I was given. So whenever I portray a female character, I try to, like, give her as much dignity as I possibly can, because I just hadn't seen any examples of that in media, even in cases where it was supposed to be about female empowerment.
To build off of that with Allison, it's been a lot of the same way for me. And when I look at, like, Emma and Warwick and Allison Selva, the whole trope on television is that established couples are not sexy. They have no room to grow in a relationship. And TV especially is very much like, oh, you are in a long-term stable relationship. Let's kill somebody. Let's just arbitrarily split you up. Let's
murder
give you a
time
child from 12 years ago. And
it's time
so
to murder.
Yes. And so I feel like, especially with Emma and Warwick, you and I have tried to write them in a way that shows that just because they're together, just because they're a couple, doesn't mean they're not sexy. It doesn't mean that they don't have stuff to learn as individuals and as a couple, and that you are stronger together than you are apart.
I feel like Ellie's very much in that basket too, because Tigress Queen is a story about two people in an arranged marriage. So it's like, you're gonna have to write them getting together somewhere in the midpoint, but, like, also getting together emotionally somewhere in the midpoint, but, like, two different points. It's like, yeah, definitely the idea of, like, starting couples earlier has also been pretty hammered in me.
Like, it's not necessarily, like, completely related to the topic, but I have noticed that as we get more LGBTQ people creating comics, like, it seems like gay culture has changed the way we look at romance and storytelling. Now there is more of a focus on people who are actually in relationships and then just being snuggly and cute together rather than they're constantly being
Yeah, like, it seems like the second
Yeah.
couple gets married or together, like, a lot of writers struggle to keep them interesting, and I love the way that's been.
Or even just have, like, several levels. Like, you've got one that gets together, you've got one that struggles, you've got one that gets together at the end. Like, you can have different levels. It's fine.
Yeah, like, I think the most romantic thing is, like, even if you have a couple that is dysfunctional and fighting and still trying to figure things out, they're still committed to each other, and they recommit every time there is a conflict that they come into contact.
You're constantly choosing the other person.
Exactly, yeah.
And I would honestly argue that constantly choosing the other person is, in some ways, you know, more important than unconditional love. Like, it is reaffirmation. It is, like, really, like, emotionally building to know, like, not only does this person love you, but they are continually choosing you.
Yeah, like, there's this big misconception that love is a feeling, and it definitely starts that way, but at a certain point, it does become a choice you make.
I think there's definitely, like, a big mood of, like, oh, you're a dickhead, but you're my dickhead, so it's fine.
Definitely.
I'm committed to this now. But yeah, definitely, it's sort of like the idea of unconditional love, but, like, unconditional love that becomes understood is a good theme. Love that is constantly renewed is a good theme.
It's re-examined.
Yeah.
So, like, you're constantly looking at the relationship and saying, like, would I rather be with this person or without this person based on how they treat me and, like, how our life is going. And just reaffirming that, yes, this is what I want, even if like it's not absolutely perfect. It's better than not having it.
And like we grow over our whole lives, and a character will grow over the course of the whole story. Like their relationship should grow with them.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes you have a character, like, they can have a good relationship, but sometimes it's just like, oh, I guess I'm someone else now. Like, I was actually reading a really good book that basically, through the midpoint, that's, like, exactly what happens. The character is like, wait, I'm, like, a completely different human being. Like, I still love you, but, like, we definitely don't have the same goals anymore. Sorry. They actually did that, in that book, The Hunger Games. Like, the creator gave her 2 love interests, so you're like, oh, I guess it's a triangle. But the point of the triangle was that one of the characters at the end was completely unappealing now, because he became like the ends justify the means freedom fighter. So the hero is like, not this. And she wasn't interested in the first one either, because she was like, you're just basically an emotional band-aid. So like they started with a triangle, and she ended up with like, I guess, and also no. So like that's an interesting like ending. Like you can have romance and still have like this really bizarre ending where the character just goes like, I don't want either of these.
You don't always have to have a happy ending. Like the romance doesn't have to be the main focus. Especially in the Hunger Games, I don't think the romance was ever the main focus of it. So like they can get away with not having the happiest ending. It's just more of a realistic, slightly bleak ending.
Yeah. Well, like, gosh, especially if you read the whole trilogy, like the way that last book ends, I think is pretty genius, especially as far as like romantic relationships are concerned. And this is basically just repeat that was said already, but the main character's goals and perception of the world completely change, as did the people around her.
Yeah,
of course.
She lost so much. Like, how can she just be like, I guess I'll have children now and be fine, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
They don't have therapists
really
in Panem.
That's true. I did appreciate that, like, there was, like, a bittersweet ending to that. Like, by all external definitions, it was a happy ending, but there was still trauma being dealt with on a daily basis by the characters that we didn't get to see beyond the end.
So we sort of about hit the 1 hour mark, so I think we should just do, closing remarks from everybody, and then the little exit spiel, and then we'll be done. So, do you guys have anything to sort of like add to sort of wrap up? Let's go by like turn. So Rennie, do you have anything to say to sort of just wrap up here?
Well, I think everything that we talked about was really important, and I think that when you are writing a romance, regardless of setting, it is really important to take all this stuff holistically. Like, you can learn about writing and how writing's done by reading a wide range, and even if your story doesn't necessarily have like abuse stuff discussed in it, like by reading those stories and absorbing those stories, you can come to a better understanding of how relationships work, how boundaries work, how to present a healthy relationship, and still incorporate mistakes and learning experiences. And sometimes somebody says a dick thing and they realize, oh no, I said a dick thing, time to learn better. Like, there is no perfect romance. There is no perfect way to present a romance, because there's no such thing as a perfect person. So I think it's really, I think it's really important to be willing to show the flaws and the strengths at the same time, because it makes a much more full whole. And I think that is just like, if anything, it's more important in fantasy stories, because it is one of the most basic ways we connect to one another.
Yeah, solid.
How about you, Megan L? What do you think? Closing statement?
Sorry, my day job just suddenly interrupted. Basically, go read a lot of romance, people. There's
Yes.
a lot of really good romance out there, and specifically for slow burns, I'm just going to throw out a couple of recs. Lore Olympus is very much a slow burn romance. I really am a fan of Miss Abbott and the Doctor on Webtoons. Read our own comic Namesake, and a few slow burn romance authors for Pro. I really like Sarah McLean. Oh God, the angst in her books are amazing. And that's basically my closing response.
How about you, Utter Megan?
Oh, that's me. Well, shoot, I think if I had to give anybody some advice, it'd be what advice you gave me a while ago, Issa, is that if you feel like you're struggling writing romance, is just to swap the genders of the characters and to whatever gender you're struggling to write or whatnot. When you're done and you feel like you have something good, just swap them back.
Yeah, the
Because
whole gender neutrality to it.
Oh gosh, yeah. Like that's probably the best way to go about it, is you do need to have like a certain for believable.
You're cutting out again. You might want to say that last part again.
Oh, I'm sorry. You do need a certain amount of chemistry for a relationship to be believable, and sometimes the easiest way to do that is to just boil them down to their basest personalities. And then finally, just have fun. It's supposed to be fun. Don't make it hard for yourself. If you're struggling with it, maybe go back to the drawing board on that.
Yeah, definitely the trick to like, if you're having trouble to write characters in a romance, to switch the genders is something I do a lot, because sometimes you have a bias inside your brain that you don't know about that's tied to gender, and by doing that you're kind of like making yourself face that. Like it can really fuck you up for a day, but like it's useful as a writing tool, and I highly recommend doing that.
Like flipping the canvas on a drawing.
Yes, exactly. That's what it is. You can be like, oh, it's right oriented. It looks great. And you flip it and you're like, oh my God, that's so many bad things. That is so many wrong things. Oh no. How about you, Allie? Any closing statements?
Tropes in and of themselves are not bad. Don't be afraid of your story falling into a trope. But how you frame it is important, and also, how would you make this compelling? Like only you can do that. So don't be afraid of like, that sort of thing. Just again, have fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, romance is about enjoyment first and foremost, both as a consumer and a writer. Like every time I draw a kissing scene, I'm always like, ooh, this is fun. Like there's a lot, even like if you're writing a toxic romance, like drawing it is just really fun. Like writing two idiots basically ruining each other is just like a delight. But don't do that, kids. But it's fun to draw. But don't live that as much as you can.
Recognize that they're idiots.
Yeah, recognize that they're morons, but enjoy the show.
I mean, knowing that they're idiots is a big part of the appeal and the flavor.
Yeah, look at these idiots. Look at them go. Look at. All right, so I guess that's it for this stream. So just to sort of reiterate, this was Slow Burn Romance and Fantasy Stories, part of the BEEHOME list of streams done by Hiveworks over this weekend. We have 4 more streams that are coming. So definitely follow us on Twitter to have the schedule for those. The next one is going to be here in less than an hour at 3 o'clock Eastern. And it's going to be, the next one is about coming of age stories and includes Magnolia Porter and Mary Cagle, who do Sleepless Domain and Monster Pulse, and also special guest star Tom Siddle, who does Get a Crit Court. So definitely log in for that one. Hell yeah, it's gonna be great.
Nice.
It's all the comics I read. I'm gonna have to work really hard to be cool in that one.
I'll probably tune in for that.
If you are tuning in to us on Twitch, reminder again that if you scroll down from the viewing window, we've got a couple of useful links that you can click on. We are currently having a sale in our store 10% off if you use Spring 2020 on books, apparel, anything that you could possibly want. So definitely check that out. We have 2 Kickstarters running. Alice in the Nightmare Book 1 and Among Us Book 1. Among Us is a romance story, so if you tuned into the romance stream, definitely check it out. Alice in the Nightmare also has romance components, but it's a YA adventure, but you should definitely check out 2. Check our Twitter for announcements and whatnot, so you can follow the rest of what's going on this weekend. And definitely also check the Iron Circus Twitter, because they are also doing a bunch of streams, and those are pretty cool. They're doing that for something called Pajama Con. It's really fun. And a reminder, people that were here, Alison Shaw, author of Tigress Queen and Persephone, Rennie Kingsley, author of The Weave, Meg Severin, author of Daughter of the Lilies, and me and Megan Levy Heaton, authors of Namesake. Definitely check out all our comics. And if you missed a part of this stream, you're just logging in right now, this will be available in full on our YouTube channel later today. So thank you so much for contributing, everybody. Do stay on the line for now. We're going to stop streaming, but we're going to have a little conversation in the back end. So thanks, everybody. See you guys in 40 minutes for the next installment.